When folks visit the museum at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, there's almost always a crowd around the section on presidential debates, because the 1960 debate between Kennedy and Nixon was the first to be televised, and many think that it changed the election's outcome. The man producing and directing the entire enterprise, sitting behind all the equipment you see in our museum, was Don Hewitt. Here's a quick glimpse of him at the time.
These scenes were taped during the preparation for the first debate between the two presidential aspirants, and they show both in a relaxed mood, chatting with each other while posing for the newspaper photographers. The sounds are normal studio sounds during the preparation for an historic program such as this turned out to be. It was Mr. Kennedy's presentation and appearance during this debate which many credit with giving his election campaign a major boost. During these few moments before the cameras and the live microphones, neither candidate was aware of the cameras except in reference to the instructions given them by the man who would direct the program, CBS Television's Don Hewitt. In these few scenes, the man who was to win appeared the more confident, his opponent somewhat nervous and worried. And it was during these few moments before that debate that our cameras were able to record these excellent close-up views of the two men.
It was Don Hewitt who took one look at the candidates and asked if they wanted makeup, a fateful question if there ever was one. Don Hewitt went on to serve as executive producer of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, and then he created the remarkable and enormously popular broadcast 60 Minutes, serving as its executive producer for 36 years, bringing extraordinary and important stories to the public. Mr. Hewitt is now executive producer, CBS News, helping to develop and launch new projects. Now you're watching golf, and President Kennedy's golfing partner in 1963 was none other than Ben Bradlee, Vice President at Large of the Washington Post. Mr. Bradlee was living in Washington, D.C. when John Kennedy moved next door. The families became close friends. Jacqueline Kennedy used to complain that it was hard to have a meaningful conversation because the men only engaged in political gossip. Mr. Bradlee was named managing editor of the Washington Post in 1965 and 3 years later became executive editor, a position he held through 1991. Under his leadership, the Washington Post won 18 Pulitzer Prizes. He is perhaps best known for his remarkable courage and smarts during the Washington Post's investigation of the Watergate cover-up, the investigation that led to the resignation of President Nixon. Mr. Bradlee is in Cambridge this semester at the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. And moderating today's conversation is Meredith White, a former executive producer and senior producer at ABC News and former senior editor of Newsweek magazine. Ms. White has won just about every award in the field, including 7 Emmys, 2 DuPonts, and the National Press Club Award. She is the niece of Byron White, who was Deputy Attorney General and later appointed by President Kennedy to the U.S. Supreme Court. Sadly, we don't have a photograph of Meredith when she was at Justice White swearing in with President Kennedy, but she assures me that she looked great in her pink dyed-to-match outfit and her pink corduroy tennis shoes. Meredith, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. And hello, Ben and Don.
Hi. Hey.
Well, it's hard after seeing those pictures, I think, to jump right into it.
I think you gotta bring the mic closer.
Thank you. I should have learned that in television. Anyway, it's hard to jump right into the present after seeing all those photographs we just saw. So I'd like to stay just with that time for a few minutes. Debbie said you produced that first debate, Don, and we know you did. And you always say that Nixon lost the debate because of a bad makeup job. Can you just tell us a few details about that night and that makeup?
It was an amazing night. Jack Kennedy walked in that studio, and he looked like a Harvard undergrad. He was perfectly tailored. He was tall, thin. He was a matinee idol. I mean, it was Cary Grant was running for president. And Richard Nixon arrived. He'd had a staphylococcus infection. He was sort of green around the gills. He smacked his knee on the car getting out. And he kind of looked like death warmed over. And I said to him, both of them, I said, would you, either one of you want some makeup? And Kennedy said, no, I don't think I want any makeup. Now Nixon heard him, and he figured he who needed makeup better not have it, or that'll be the story the next day, that one of them was made up and one of them wasn't. And it was a night that the right guy won for the wrong reason. The better looking of two people should be Miss America, not Mr. President. But that's what happened that night. And then you get the historians that go to you and say, well, it wasn't all about makeup. What about Kimoy and Matsu? And I always say, okay, where is Kimoy and Matsu, and who said what? They don't have the slightest idea, but they spout all this baloney. But it really was, one guy looked like a president nobody had ever seen before. Another guy looked like a ward boss somewhere, and that's what decided the election.
Well, Ben, you were at the debate too.
I was the pool reporter.
Yeah.
One of them.
For Newsweek.
Yep.
And Deborah referred to the fact that you and Kennedy had become close friends and lived on the same street in Georgetown. Maybe I can touch. Can you hear this now?
Maybe your mic is not hooked up.
Get it really close. Get it really close, you see. You keep getting away from it. Get close.
But you're away from yours.
I'm a boy.
You're a boy. Well, I'll try to be more like a boy here then.
There you go.
Anyway, you and the Kennedys used to wheel your baby carriages down the same street in Georgetown. You became great social friends. You were a foursome. How did you handle the issue of am I a friend or am I a reporter in covering that presidential campaign?
Well, there was so many people in Washington trying to handle it for me that I didn't really have much trouble. The editors of Newsweek were so wanted to be sure that no young politician was going to take their boy to the cleaners that they went through all my copy with a fine-tooth comb. And so did Hugh Sidey, who was the Time correspondent, my opposite number. And if I got something in my very limited files that a news magazine allows, Sidey would go to the president and raise hell, say, how come Bradlee got that? And there was a little nugget that he got for the next issue of Time.
But how come Bradlee did get that and someone else
because
didn't
Bradlee
get
worked
that?
hard and
was a very good friend.
you don't look a good gift horse in the mouth.
Would you have allowed that kind of reporter friendship when you were at the Washington Post, so a friend covering a candidate?
I don't think you can tell a reporter that he can't have a friend. And if he has a friend, you don't. If he's a good reporter, you don't have to tell him that you can't carry water for your friend. And it was we had an understanding that what he said was on the record, unless I could use what he said, unless he told me not to. And I made that deal, and I would make it again. I would allow a reporter. Yeah, you don't have to formalize it and get it in writing.
Right.
But the idea of a reporter is to establish relationships with people, and they can be friendship, they can be scorn, they can be anything you want. But a relationship is going to develop, and if it's a close one, you've just got to decide whether you're going to be a friend of the famous or you're going to be a journalist. And that wasn't very hard.
Well, let's get to the topic of this evening's conversation. What's happened to the news? And when Deborah first told me that was what the topic was going to be, when I heard it, it sounds like something very bad has happened. So what's happened to the news? Do you think something's gone wrong with our business? It's probably way too simplistic, but is there one word or sentence that comes to mind when you think of what's happened to the news?
Yeah, it's way too simplistic.
It's way too
I'm not sure anything's
happened. Well, you're on television. Try to be simplistic.
That's not tough. Actually, I think what's really wrong with the news is too much of it.
Is what?
I mean, it's too much of it. And it's become a commodity rather than a service. And, you know, you've got, I'm not going to go too deeply into the troubles that CBS is in right now because I would like to keep my job, and I got a nice one. I'm not going to go that far into that. What's happened to news? Broadcasting is a funny animal. Publishers go into news because that's what they want to do. Broadcasters went into news because that's what they had to do. That's the only way they get licenses to broadcast. You had to do a certain amount of public service to have a license to broadcast when the FCC actually sat over broadcasting. And a lot of guys who wanted no part of news or electronic journalism or whatever you want to call it got into this business because that was the only way they could. They had to pay back for their licenses. They weren't particularly interested in it. You know, there were no Kay Grahams, there were no Punch Sulzbergers really in news. There was one, and I was lucky enough to spend part of this afternoon with him. Frank Stanton, who is now 97 years old, was president of CBS when I first went there. He lives in Boston. I went to see him today. He's kind of my hero. If I have a hero in the news business, he's sitting right next to me. Let me tell you, Ben Bradlee gave me the best piece of advice I ever got in my life. CBS was prohibiting us from running a tobacco story about a company that was up to its ears in all sort of skullduggery as far as nicotine was concerned, and they wouldn't let me put it on the air, and the Washington Post was beating the hell out of me about it. And I called Ben to complain, and that was the time I got the best piece of advice I ever got in my life. Ben Bradlee said to me, "Kid, you just got picked off first. Go back to the dugout, sit down, and shut up." Wow. That's the best thing I ever heard.
Ben, what about you? Is there, with that question, what's happened to when I saw you last week, you said to me, well, the news is the news. That's what's happened to the news, but so I
We're in two different businesses.
I know.
And what's happened to newspapers are, in one way of judging newspapers, is by their circulation, and the circulation of all newspapers, virtually all newspapers, is declining. The reason it's declining is that we can't get kids to read. In the old days when the circulation, I mean, not so long ago, my own experience, I used to fight my dad for the sports section in the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. And that's how I learned to read, and then quite soon I learned after that how to figure out the averages and therefore do a little arithmetic. That's not happening now. Kids are not interested in newspapers until they don't become readers until they're in their late teens or early 20s.
But will they ever become readers again? Because they're going to other sources now for the news.
Well,
they turn on their computers and they get the news there. I'm not so sure they're not interested in the news just because they're not reading newspapers.
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I think they certainly join they start to subscribe at a later time, but they do start to subscribe. And I don't know. All the Post has on the internet has got, you know, umpteen 100,000 hits per whatever, and so some of those ought to be able to count as circulation, but they don't because you don't charge them anything. The next American fortune is going to be made by somebody who figures out how to charge people for using the internet.
Yes.
The one word that seems to dominate journalism today is demographics. Everybody is trying to lower the demographic of either the newspaper or a television news or radio news. And
well, for the 18 to 49.
Yeah, the 18 to 49s, and I sort of...
And the rest of us don't exist.
That we don't exist. Nobody in this room reads the newspaper as far as they're concerned, and they're really not looking for you. They're looking for a younger audience. And I once told the New York Times that I had a great way for them to lower their demographic. They should take that section they've got called dining out, and if they change it to making out, I bet they could sell a lot more newspapers.
But it's not making out any longer, it's hooking up.
Hooking up.
It's not making
You
out.
told me that last week. You're the only one I know who knows that.
Well, I'm sure someone will call me tonight and say it's not hooking up any longer, it's something else.
Yeah.
Last time I heard it was hooking up. But, I want to go back to Frank Stanton, because you call him the patron saint of broadcasting.
Yeah, right.
And in reading both of your books and reading about your relationship with Stanton and your relationship with Katharine Graham, I was so struck when I was in your office 10 days ago, and Ben's in an office now. Your office is being renovated, so you're in temporary quarters, and there's one picture on your wall, and it's Katharine Graham, and you've tacked it up, and she's looking at you eye level still, and I was so struck by that. And
Smiling.
Smiling. But those people aren't around any longer with the big companies buying up newspapers and television stations and networks. People at the top don't care about news like that anymore. And you had Katharine Graham and you had Frank Stanton at your side, and I don't think people have any idea of what that's like today, to have someone like that helping you out and supporting you.
I think it's the obsession with the 18 to 49s that have made those people sort of obsolete. And I'm not sure that in today's world, the Katharine Grahams and the Bill Paleys and the David Sarnoffs and the Leonard Goldensons would be all that successful. They owned those companies. They weren't beholden always to a stock price. So they did what they thought was right. Today, I don't think you can do what you think is right. You are beholden to stockholders and shareholders, and I think that sets the tone for what you read and what you hear and what you see on television.
Do you see that a lot, Ben, in newspapers today? Can you look at it and think they're after the 18 to 49, or they're not doing this kind of story any longer because we need to make profits? Are you aware of it at the Washington Post?
Well, I think my successor is, but
But you're still there every day. You go in every day. You're in on the meetings.
Because I'm sick. My wife opens the door and I just get out of there and go down.
Welcome to the club.
I think that some newspapers who are lucky still have the equivalent of a Katharine Graham. They look at the...
Not very many.
Well, the Washington Post does.
Yes.
Don Graham. The New York Times has the Sulzberger family. I don't know the young one now as well as I knew Punch, but Punch was a very powerful force there, and the New York Times was never better than it was under his ruling. And I think the same thing can be said for and there were Winchips and Taylors around here for quite a long time.
Right.
And so I think, look,
but with Knight Ridder and Gannett and Newhouse buying up all the newspapers,
that's what worries me most about them buying all the papers, is losing the community leader who is no longer a local citizen. The fact of the matter is that newspapers, the good newspapers in this country, are much better today than they were 30 years ago.
You're the only one I've talked to in the last 10 years who says that. I
can prove it to you. Just get a Boston Globe of 30 years ago and check it with today. It's larger because they're getting more advertising and they're getting more white space for news stories. They're better designed. It's much easier to read. It's better organized. When I wrote my book, I picked up a 1965 Washington Post, which was the day I came back to the Post. It's bloody unreadable. Unreadable. Long columns. No picture bigger than a column and a half. Long columns, the type, blurring. And the makeup is just unfriendly. And the reporters, the quality of the reporters, way better, way better. especially women.
Yes, but most people do look at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Miami Herald, the Chicago Tribune, and talk about how the news well has been gutted, their investigative teams are gone. Is this an exaggeration?
Well, I don't know. You know, I've only worked for one daily newspaper in my life, and I read several, but not. How many dailies are there left? Is 1,000 dailies in America now?
I think something 1,200,
yeah,
something
1,200.
like that.
Well, I don't read many of them.
Well, Don, I know you said you didn't want to talk about the CBS situation, but I think it's hard to be on this subject of what's happened to the news and not bring that up and try to get into it a little bit. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the crisis, and it was the story that CBS did on Bush's National Guard service, which was based on what appear to be falsified documents. And currently, an outside team is investigating what happened there, and their report is due any day. Can you talk about how you think that happened?
Dan will have stubbed his toe badly. I've already said that I wouldn't have done the story because I didn't think there was a story.
Why didn't you think there was a story?
I don't think there's any story in the fact that George Bush didn't go to Vietnam. Bill Clinton went to Oxford, so he wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. I would venture a guess that the entire graduating class at Yale that graduated with Bush, maybe 1 or 2% of them ever went to Vietnam. People got out of going to Vietnam. First of all, Vietnam has a lot of Iraq about it. You know, Bush may have told us a lot of baloney about atomic weapons. Lyndon Johnson told us a lot of baloney about the Gulf of Tonkin and got us into a war that we never should have been in. And, you know, it's a little like, I love what Jon Stewart said about the whole thing. He said about John Kerry, why would anyone want to vote for somebody who was too dumb not to get out of going to Vietnam? Which is sort of like that great story of the guy that was on trial for his life, and somebody said, do you want to be tried by a jury or by a judge? And he said, no, I'd much rather be tried by a judge. I wouldn't want to leave my fate in the hands of 12 people who were not smart enough to get out of jury duty. So, you know, the whole... Tell a tale out of school. It was at Ben's birthday party this summer that John McCain said to me, I beg Kerry, don't get into Vietnam. It's a loser. Forget it. There's no way. Now, if any was ever a war hero, it was John McCain. He was in a prison there for a long time. Why he ever brought it up and why Rather got involved in it is beyond me, but he did, and now he's paying for it.
But back to the Bush story, Bush claimed that he had fulfilled his service, and so I think that...
A lot of guys
we know
claimed
a lot of
things.
people who got out of...
You know how many guys got out of going to
But
Vietnam because their fathers brought them out of it? If I had had kids that age, at that point, I think I would have done the same thing.
Don't say that.
No, come on. I was there. I used to say to them, what are we doing here? I could never figure out what anybody was doing in that country.
I disagree with you about it being a story. Of course it was a story. And if the facts that they were investigating had been true and weren't discoverably wrong beforehand, if they'd been true, it was a story.
Yes,
I think.
But you better have it nailed before you listen.
Oh, yes, you
if
have
you're going
to
to take a shot at the President of the United States, you better have pretty good aim.
Yeah.
Well, yes, you have to have it nailed, but Bush had made a point out of the fact that he did fulfill his duty.
Yeah.
He did his service in the National Guard, and he did it according to the rules, and that's what that story was about.
But that story was told when he ran against Al Gore. There was a whole thing about that Bush never went to Vietnam. It was not new. There was nothing new about it. It wasn't worth jeopardizing a career that rather had that many years for a story that you weren't really sure of. And I to this day, I don't understand why it got on the air without more examination.
Well, there's a headline in today's USA Today, and I think they were quoting Andy Rooney as
Yes.
impending doom at
I spoke to
CBS.
Andy about that.
Well, what's it like there now to have a
Yeah, he
an
said
outside...
about doom. I don't see the doom there, but it might happen. But my favorite quote is Andy Rooney in that story, who was a very old friend, said that if you diminish the evening news, you diminish the public's ability to make intelligent decisions. And all I could think was, what intelligent decisions? I don't know about any intelligent decisions that the public has made recently that you have to worry about.
Well, I don't think we're going to get you to say much more about this. I understand. I'm going to back off.
I want to go back to work tomorrow.
I don't mean to just pick on television. It hasn't been a great few years for print either. We had Jason Blair at the New York Times and Jack Kelly at USA, to name two star reporters who fabricated parts of big stories. Ben, you know a little bit about handling a public crisis. Most people, I'm sure, remember that in 1981, a young Post reporter named Janet Cook won a Pulitzer for a story she did about an 8-year-old crack addict she called Jimmy. It turned out she made the whole thing up. You had to return the Pulitzer, and she resigned. How did you ever recover from that crisis and get your readers back?
I didn't know anything. I'd never taken a course in damage control after I left the Navy. But if your paper's reputation is been shattered like that, the only way I can think of is to tell absolutely every fact and tell it to the readers. And we have an ombudsman at the Washington Post, and we asked our ombudsman to investigate it, take as long as he wanted, so long as it didn't exceed 3 days. And
how many days did it take?
It took him 3 days. Well, it may have even taken him 2. I don't know. It was 4 pages in the newspaper. We gave him all the help he asked for, and the way we got through that is because there has never been a fact about the Janet Cook case that was not in the Washington Post on that story. Every rotten detail was out there.
It was very tough on some of the editors at the Post.
Yes,
I remember it was
a miserable week. I thought until the New York Times trouble this time, I thought that Janet Cook was going to be the second paragraph of my obituary.
Now it'll be the third.
No, it won't. I don't think it will. I'm going to outlast the guys.
Well, it comes down to trust, and you can't keep track of everything that's going on in a newspaper, and you have to trust your reporters. You have to trust your producers. You call trust the jugular of journalism, and Janet
Did I
Cook,
say that?
you did. It's in your book. I love that part of your book.
Phrase.
It's great. Remember that next
Now
time. Janet Cook and Jason Blair and Jack Kelly certainly expose that jugular. What safeguards do you have if a reporter is willing to lie like that?
Well, you have none. You just got to wait, hunker down, because it's coming. We investigated every word she ever wrote at the Post, and we couldn't find anything, except there was a quote from some woman actress that we had suspicions about, but it wasn't a bad quote. It didn't make anybody look bad. It was just too good a quote. And but she didn't do that as a habit. She did it once.
Janet
She
Cook
was
did it once.
extremely ambitious. And
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that when you went back and you looked at her other stories, there was
find
nothing else. And it's usually different in these other cases. When they went back and looked at past reporting, they found in Jason Blair or Jack Kelly, they found a lot of other instances of that.
The training to be a reporter, or when you hire an experienced reporter, is to develop this relationship of trust, and it gets to be automatic.
Well, nowhere was it more crucial than in your reporting of Watergate. You had two fairly inexperienced reporters.
Very inexperienced.
And Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, they were relying on a source to lead them through key points of the story, someone we later knew as a Deep Throat, and you didn't know who that was. And you say today that you would never have tolerated that.
Well,
And I just wanted to know why, in looking back, you think that you wouldn't have.
Well, I find that rather hard to explain, that I didn't ask until after the fact, when they began to build a little bit of a sort of jealousy and anti-Post prominence over it. And I thought that Deep Throat, and the Deep Throat was in the movie and in the garage, and he was hanging around like that, very dramatic. And I asked him, well, I think before the movie, but who the hell is this person? I knew where he worked. I knew that he was a he, and I knew that roughly his rank in the pecking order of Washington. Mm-hmm. And he told me, and that was the end.
Were you surprised
No,
when
I
you
don't
found out who
answer
it
that
was?
question. I didn't.
But you do say in your book that you can't believe other people haven't guessed who it was.
Well, I did say
You
that.
say it's so obvious. You
No,
can't
I didn't
believe.
say it was so obvious.
Well, I wish I had.
What
the
I
book
said,
here.
well, excuse me, what I said is, it seems to me that in this age of computers and how you can recreate the decision-making process on a computer by putting in all the alternatives every time you get, was it raining that day? And, was it, that's the only thing I can think of, but was it, and just ask the questions. And you would say, oops, that eliminates so-and-so because he wasn't in Washington, mm-hmm. and he was somewhere else. That you could do it, you could guess it. And I ruined a lot of people's sleep when they were trying to do it. But
You're not going to admit it, but the front runner is John Dean. John Dean is the one the name
John
you hear the
Dean,
most.
yeah. That's right. He's written 2 books identifying another person, a different person,
well, sure.
as a Deep Throat.
Wouldn't you?
He's got a 3rd one out, and I don't know if he's got another candidate yet. Don't put your money on it.
Okay, that eliminates one.
We think.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the red state, blue state hysteria, since the campaign. And one network anchor said the other day that he's going to hit the road so he doesn't report on red state issues from a blue state broadcast. And the editor of the New York Times said maybe he needs to reopen their Kansas bureau. And the president of ABC News says maybe we need people who live in Michigan so we understand the attitudes out there. What do you make of those statements?
Baloney. It's all baloney.
The last one is the dumbest statement I ever.
It's really dumb.
Because
if you can't figure out this country from wherever you are, get in another business.
I thought these statements actually would backfire because it makes it sound like we in New York are going to go out of our big offices and come out and see what you little folks are all about. And I just...
Well, it proves he never was an editor or ran a reporting or ran a bureau. Oh, let's call that guy up in Michigan. Where does he live now? What town in Michigan? And what,
That's not the way you take on New York.
How do I get him?
Move to Boston if you want to take on New York.
But do you think that the media is isolated from... Do you think there is a media elite in this country? Why there's such a belief that there is? It's like those of us who come from other parts of the country, when we come to New York or Washington, we lose our minds and we become someone who has no idea of what's going on anywhere else. Do you buy that at all?
No.
Do you,
The guys who work for me are just like everybody else. They got mortgages. They're trying to put their kids through school. They're paying on a house. They're paying on, I mean, just because you live in one place geographically doesn't mean that you've lost touch with the rest of the country. I don't believe that for a second.
We all hear that thing over and over again, too, that there's a liberal bias in the media. And I know in your book you said you got so sick of hearing it. But what do you say to people when they say that? You guys don't play it down the middle.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that there are more Democrats than Republicans on the staff of the Washington Post, okay? But not much more.
But how are you even sure of that? I don't
ask anybody, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're not aware when we work with people, often whom they vote for or what their political affiliation is. It's an assumption.
Well, I don't know how. I mean, I'd be more interested in that if I could think of a way of changing it. If I am going to say, oh, now wait a minute, we've got 53 Democrats, and you would make the 54th, and that would put you ahead. Put the Democrats. You can't do it that way. If you can't spot bias when you see it, you ought to be in another line of work. And I think the good papers
You're absolutely right.
do that.
Listen, I've worked for this ultra-liberal CBS all my life, and when I left, the first guy that tried to hire me was Bill O'Reilly. So, I'm not too worried about.
What do you think of Bill O'Reilly?
He ain't the worst guy in the world.
He called Mike Wallace his idol, his model for what he became.
But there's a lot of PR that goes with that, but he ain't the worst guy I ever knew. I've known guys that are worse than that. He's pretty, the Bill O'Reilly he actually said that he hadn't made up his mind between Kerry and Bush. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, at one point. And he also said, Mike had asked him about gay marriage. And he said, if there's a choice between a little kid being brought up by two men or two women who live together affectionately, or going to an orphanage, he'd much prefer the kid be brought up by a couple, whether they're the same couple or not. I thought it was I didn't sort of expect that to come out of Bill O'Reilly, but it did.
Mm-hmm. Do you watch Bill O'Reilly, Ben?
No, he doesn't.
Do you watch Fox News? No, never?
On Sunday when they run the football games, I watch them.
Sure.
So you don't think you're missing anything by not?
I really don't. I probably watch more news than anybody you know. I mean, in Washington, you can see both CBS. You could see 2 out of the 3 nightly newses. I see 2 of them, and then join the Jim Lehrer show.
What's the third one you leave out? You watch 2 every night.
It's in the process of being changed, if you want to know. I used to watch ABC at 6:30 because I was anticipating seeing Jim Wooten, whom I think is the best television correspondent alive today. Unfortunately, he's in a fight with the managers, so they never have him on the show. And then I watched Brokaw, and he's going, geez, my life is going to change. And then I watched Wooten. Now, I watch Lehrer. So I'm going to wait till the CBS thing shakes out a little bit, and then make a new lineup. Mm-hmm. But it's an hour and a half of news.
With the CBS situation and changing in March, and we know that the nightly newscasts need younger viewers. Do you think it's the time to just take that, for CBS to take that half hour and just blow up the whole thing? Think of a completely different way to...
My gut tells me, I know this for a fact, when Mel Karmazin ran Viacom, He tried to buy CNN, and Dick Parsons didn't want to sell it. My gut tells me that sometime in the next 5 years, ABC, NBC, and CBS will have cable news channels of their own. In fact, I once got permission from CBS to call Michael Eisner and Iger and suggest that CBS and CBS and ABC should pool their news operation and run a cable channel opposite MSNBC and CNN and Fox. Eisner didn't want to do it. But somehow, the evening news is a strange animal. If you lock you in a room for a year and you can only watch Rather, he can only watch Brokaw, and I can only watch Jennings, at the end of the year, none of us would know anything the other one didn't know. It's the same broadcast. It isn't like a liberal newspaper and a conservative newspaper. It's the same broadcast, and it's a popularity contest. Instead of Miss America, it's Mr. America. Who has won the popularity contest? And it's got nothing to do with the news. It's who do you like? If you like Rather, you watch Rather. If you like Brokaw, you watch Brokaw. You watch Jennings. And somehow the CNNs and the MSNBCs are going to eventually take over this business because they've got more bureaus, they spend more money, they're more serious about what they do, and I think eventually you're going to find that CBS News is going to be part of a, not on its regular network, but it's going to be a cable channel. ABC will probably be a cable channel, and I think MSNBC someday may take over whatever NBC does on the air now. And if you want to go watch it, watch it. And if you don't want to watch it, don't.
But CBS is still going to have that hour from 6:30 to 7.
I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure that these guys haven't figured out that this is a drag and they can do better with Jeopardy or Entertainment Tonight.
Or Jon Stewart.
Or Jon Stewart.
Glad to know you get
yes.
news from Jon Stewart.
So maybe they're going to take their news and put it into an all-news cable channel, which is not a bad idea, incidentally. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want news, you know where to get it.
Well, I'm so struck when I go on the website of the Washington Post or the New York Times or MSNBC. On the computer, it looks like everybody's morphing into the same thing because newspapers are constantly updating their stories and they're adding video. And the networks' websites are just making their stories longer. And it all in that computer is starting to look like that we're morphing into the same delivery system. I've seen computers in both of your offices, but I don't think I've ever seen you use one.
I don't know.
Was it on or off?
Oh, I should have died in the last century. I can't make contact with this one. It goes over my head.
But that surprises me about you, because
surprises me about me, too.
Well, you used to take every single new invention that came along in television and figure out, how am I going to tweak this? No, you're not.
Let me tell you something about being old. When Al Newhart retired as chairman of Gannett and the founder of USA Today, he was toasted in Washington by Tom Daschle, who said that he had a problem he could never solve. He was too old to work for a newspaper, and he was too young to work for 60 Minutes. And then Teddy Kennedy took up the same theme. I got introduced at a roast in Washington, and Teddy said that I was the guy who would come up with the idea of embedding reporters with the troops. So how else do you think Mike Wallace got into George Washington's boat? So, that's why I don't mess around with a computer.
But I like the fact that you both have them behind here to make it look like...
Yeah, it looks like you're doing something.
Well, because I said to Ben last week, can I send you an email about...
I don't know how to... Yeah, you'll have to send my secretary.
And you pointed to your assistant outside and said she takes...
She knows where it is.
She turns the computer on, and once it's on, I can write letters on it, but I can't...
Well, I guess I can't ask you about my next question then. I was going to ask you if you believed in the power of the bloggers, since they're the ones that discovered the mistakes in the CBS documents.
I sure do.
I do. They're great.
Well, they're
I
watching.
don't read them, but they're great.
They keep us honest.
They're becoming our fact checkers.
Yep. Sure.
I think there are more people. I think it's actually going to become so much harder to make mistakes on stories, because as soon as you have put something on, people are commenting on it, either on your own websites or they are starting to, they go online somewhere. And
What's bad about that? That's pretty good.
I think it's great.
Well, I don't think it's great. How do you know who the hell these people are? I mean, at least if you buy a newspaper or turn on a set to a network news, you know who the hell they are, and you know the people. But how do you know who is signing the blogging thing and saying the bids?
You mean whether or not they have any background?
They have any expertise at all?
Well, a lot of them do. It's just become much more democratic out there. People have a way to get. They have a way to get their information out there. They have the technology to be heard, and they're using it.
The Drudge Report has broken more stories than I think any other news organization in America.
Well, he's one of.
He's wrong sometimes, sure. So are we.
We're going to start questions probably in about 5 minutes. So if people want to line up, if you have questions for either Don or Ben, I'm sure they would love to hear them. Ben, I was going to ask you, one of the greatest things that I think you did at the Washington Post and is start the style section. I lived in Washington when it first came out, and I remember looking at that section and thinking, wow, can you really say that? Can you really ask those questions? And I just thought it told more about the way the Capitol worked than many of the news stories. And why were you so convinced that you needed a style section? It's been imitated by every single newspaper in the country.
Well, I think the women's pages were the dullest pages I ever read. I mean, starting out at the Post, the section was called For and About, and then in larger type women. But the type was sort of dead, for women like this. And it was.
You even did menus, recipes, I think.
God, out the ears. And it was outrageous. It was outrageous. It was very insulting to women, as a matter of actual fact. And the birth of style was one of the great times I've had in the business. And I got Katharine Graham interested, and she was so excited about it, but she didn't want to lose all the pals at the Ladies Friendly who were going to say, "Well, you can't say that about this." I think it's having a kind of a rough time now. I think it's a little bit boring, but it's going to. I think they'll change.
Well, it sure wasn't when I was in
Washington,
and it turned people into human beings, and
yeah, but it was the first section a lot of people read, including men. Instead of fighting for the sports section, you'd see the dads go for the style section.
It was hot copy, and it was really what you talked about.
We got to get it back.
Is there anything you'd add at the Post if you were running it today? Any other section? Anything beyond style? Why can't I ask you?
Well, because I don't want to be sour grapes. I've been out of there 13 years.
But you're not out of there. You're still there.
Yeah, I'm still there. But but I'm not answering that question every day either. I don't think I would be. Sure, there are some things, and I know there are some things that Len Downey, who's my successor, would change. We've got to change. Think of what happens when Baghdad breaks out. You have to change the paper. You have to change the staff. You've got to try to find money to man a 4-man bureau that you didn't have before, 4-person bureau.
Don, what about you? When you came up with the idea for 60 Minutes, it was about the same time that Ben came up with the style section. I think 60 Minutes started, I think, the year before. And you called it a combination of high Murrow, referring to Edward R. Murrow, and low Murrow. Why were you so convinced that was the right time for
Well, I was doing these, after I did the Cronkite News, I was doing documentaries, and I was bored silly, and I realized that 7% of the audience watched documentaries. The good ones, the bad ones, didn't make any difference. They loved documentaries. And one day I had lunch with Norman Isaacs, who used to run the Courier Journal. And during lunch he said, "You know how many people read editorials?" I said, "I don't know." He said, 7%. I said, "Oh my God, they're the same people who watch documentaries." I said, there's got to be a way to raise that number. And so I figured, one day, I used to direct a thing with Ed Morrow called See It Now, which was very prestigious. It was on Sunday afternoons, but not many people watched it. And then Morrow did a show called Person to Person, where she visited people like Marilyn Monroe at home, and it wasn't very good, but it was wildly popular. And John Crosby in the Herald Tribune coined a phrase, and he called it high Morrow and low Morrow. And I looked at it and I said, "Oh my God, that's the answer. You put high Morrow and low Morrow in the same broadcast, you got a winner." You can look in Marilyn Monroe's closet if you're also willing to look in Robert Oppenheimer's laboratory. And you want to mix up the Konrad Adenauers and the Winston Churchills and the President of the United States with Robin Williams, Jackie Gleason, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and that's what Life magazine did so well, and that became the formula for 60 Minutes, so that it wasn't an elite, holier-than-thou, as most of these documentaries were, which nobody ever looked at. And for reasons that still stun me, David Burke knows this very well because he was there during those days, we had 22 years in the top 10. That's sort of, I don't know why. No one was more surprised than I was at the success of it, but it worked, and the formula was that simple.
Well, I think it's the most successful television show in history, hasn't it been?
It made
so far?
$200 million profit over the 22 years it was in the top 10, and no news broadcast ever did anything like that. The Today Show comes close. I think the Today Show makes more money than any other show in television today. And we did at that time. And now they want to lower the demographics, and old guys like me are out. We don't know anything about it. I read gossip columns. I never heard of the people. I don't know who they are. I see names, I go, who are those people? I don't know. I live in another world. That's why they wanted to make a change.
We'll go to questions in just 1 minute, but I was struck by the fact that in the first few pages of both of your books, you each mention a Hitchcock movie as being very pivotal and inspiring you to go into journalism, and the movie was Foreign Correspondent. And Ben, I know you say that you used to just cry your eyes out watching it over and over again as a teenager, I think. And then you said all you wanted was the look, the Foreign Correspondent
Yeah,
look.
I wanted...
You wanted the trench coat.
That's right, I wanted a trench coat more than anything in the world.
But you both had such a romantic vision of the line of work you wanted to go into.
Romantic life.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
You don't get shot.
That's right.
So it turned out to be a little bit more even than you thought it would be.
I had two favorite movies. I never knew whether I wanted to be Hildy Johnson in Front Page, or I wanted to be Julian Marsh, the producer in 42nd Street. And I walked into a television studio, I thought, oh my God, I can be both of them. And that's what happened, more or less.
Well, thank you so much. I think we should go to some of the... And if you want to identify yourselves, you can.
You don't have to.
And we'd like questions and not statements. So why don't we just start with this line right here.
Hi, my name is Uli Tangen. I live in Boston. I'm an aspiring journalist. And I'd have to say that one thing that I notice with people my age is that there is some kind of disconnect or some kind of disinterest in the news. And I was wondering, especially from you, Don, if the lack of young faces on television news and on broadcast news, I mean, I can't think of anyone below the age of 40 or 45 that's in national news or that's in network news. And I'm wondering if that's a reason why young people feel a disconnect from broadcast news.
Sure, that's why we're here and we're not working.
No, but sure, it must be. It must be. You can't see how old the reporters are, but they're a lot younger.
And why is that not changing? Why won't they have them?
Why won't they have?
Younger people in those front lines.
Every day they're getting younger and younger, and that's what they want. They want you, and Ben and I don't know that much about how to reach you, so they're getting guys who know how.
You want to?
For what it's worth, I think that youth is greatly overrated, as these gentlemen on stage have shown to us this evening. And we'd love to have these qualities in our so-called leaders that can tell stories, be relaxed, and be honest and direct. I have a couple of points I would like to make in the form of a question, which is not necessarily something for you to respond to right now, but something to consider. And that is stories by commission and stories by omission. You referred to some stories. I came here a little bit late from work. It's tough coming through traffic in Boston, but welcome. The stories of omission is the story that's not being talked about, and that is, or at least if it is, I'm among the 7% that still hasn't seen it really being talked about, and that is why the Hart-Rudman Commission and the reports that also preceded it, but especially the Hart-Rudman Commission in the opinion of Joseph Nye of the Kennedy School of Government, said that, as he reported in October of 2001, which was the first inkling I had, that there were indeed warnings, contrary to the 9/11 Commission report that came out more recently, saying that we should have been shocked, yes, by what happened, but not surprised because we were all told. That's one story. The other story is referred to as the January 20th, 1988 story, Hart campaigns secretly funded, which Bernard Cobb of the Kennedy School of Government says was a grossly exaggerated story, and yet it was taken as truth, connecting the 84 and 88 campaigns. Another story is the December 17th story, and that was where Christine Keeler was pictured on the boat with Lynn Armand, and she was the one that befriended Donna Rice. Wendy Rice, that's correct. And Christine Keeler, as we know, maybe 30 years ago, for those of us that are not young and light-headed, but wise and older and know about these things, brought down the British government in 1963. So those are just a few thoughts I'd like perhaps that you might look into as something to investigate or look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Christine Keeler? I've never heard of her in a long time.
Hello. Oops. Wow, that's very loud. My name is Ann Collins. I live in Boston. I'm an editor. My question is about war coverage. When I was a kid, I used to sneak down to the basement and go through old Life magazines to learn about World War II. And I learned about the good and the bad and the ugly. What I noticed about current war coverage is we're not even allowed to see a coffin, let alone a dead body or mutilated body. And though it might gross us out, I think it might get us the hell out of that war if the news people could present us with what war is really like.
You've got to be kidding. You haven't seen dead bodies on television and newspapers. They're every day. You don't see coffins because they won't let you into the Dover, Delaware Air Force Base where the coffins fly back. But, I mean, my God, if you haven't seen enough dead bodies on television, you should see a shrink.
I'm seeing a shrink.
Is she a shrink?
She's saying a shrink. Yes. But I know that.
I didn't mean that in any way insulting.
I think actually some of the most powerful writing is being done out of Iraq right now. I think of Dexter Filkins.
And
stories
John
in the
Burns
New York
and Dexter
Times.
Filkins have been sensational.
The trouble with Iraq right now is that it's so dangerous that the reporters
can't even go out.
They don't even go out much.
Can we go right over to this line?
Frank Rich and other commentators have been concerned with the appointment of someone like Brian Williams replacing Tom Brokaw. They're concerned about reducing and redefining the content of the news. Don, in your position, can you be a hero and devote yourself to talking about higher standards of content for broadcast news? And can someone replace Dan Rather with Dan Rather? Dan Rather.
First of all, I called Frank Rich after that column, and I said, Frank, you have laid out in detail all these crimes against journalism that were committed by broadcasters. What you admitted from your piece was that all of those things happened on television stations owned and operated by the New York Times. The New York Times will sit in judgment of what television does and doesn't do, and yet it all happens. They own 4 CBS, 2 NBC, and 2 ABC stations. They run an editorial about how disgusting Fear Factor is, and Fear Factor runs on 2 New York Times owned and operated stations. One more thing about Frank, who I like very much. Frank Rich called me one day and he said, I think it's disgusting that CBS ran a sitcom the other night instead of a presidential news conference. And I said, let me find out about that. And I found out that CBS gave all of its affiliate stations a choice. They could have the sitcom or they could have the presidential news conference. And the 2 New York Times stations took the sitcom. I mean, there's an hypocrisy, and it's all, the Washington Post will sit down and do a piece about something that's on television that's disgusting, and they're probably right, but they run it. There runs on Washington Post stations.
I don't know that.
What?
Did the Post stations do that?
The Post stations are affiliated with the networks.
I know they are, but they didn't. I don't know whether they ran this or they ran.
Not bad, but they run broadcasts that the television critics of the newspapers find atrocious, and they run on the stations owned by the newspaper. Someday, I would just like them to say, we own a station that carries this broadcast that we think shouldn't be on the air.
But Don, I asked whether you. I
wouldn't want to hang by my thumb so
I asked whether you could be a hero and do something about that. Are you in a position to?
I think maybe you're looking for somebody a lot younger who's been around. I've been around there too long.
Over here, we'll just go back and forth.
Okay. Mr. Hewitt touched on an interesting subject, the Gulf of Tonkin, briefly in passing. Mr. Bradlee had some very interesting comments to make that a few years back in London in '87 when he discussed the Gulf of Tonkin incident which led to America's intervention in Vietnam. I'd like to quote some of those observations from him, quote unquote, I would like to talk about government lying, calculated lies, the willful deception of the public for political end, especially under the disguise of national security, and what an awful price we pay for such lies under any name. Misinformation, disinformation, deceit, deception, or just plain dishonesty. In America, the press is curiously shy, even embarrassed, when faced with the need to use some form of the verb to lie. And he went on to say, we are too often close enough to the establishment ourselves, we the press, to be comfortable in calling a lie a lie. These processes, of course, have continued in Iraq.
Who said that?
Were you, yes.
Who are you quoting? I don't know.
I'm quoting Mr. Bradlee from some remarks he made in London in '87 when he discussed the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
That's not fair, pal. That's not fair. But I'm not sure I disagree with it.
Well, I hope not. I agree with it, even if you don't any longer agree with it. I'd like to know if you can amplify on that, given what's happened in Iraq, given what happens in Palestine. These processes are going on continually. Why is the press more concerned about exposing their pals in power and their lies than they are about the deadly consequences of these lies to the millions of victims of American aggression around the world?
I've been worried about that for since since I was a child. I'm teaching at Harvard on this subject. I can't say that I'm teaching lying at Harvard, but I am teaching. I'm conducting an inquiry into how come, and I'm talking to psychiatrists. I'm talking to professors of religion, philosophers, about what makes how come lying is more and more popular, and the liars are paying less and less of a price. Part of that, I know the answer is business. There's more crime in the business section of our newspapers now than there is in the metro section.
Right.
But I don't think that quote sounded pretty good to me. And I don't like to hear old quotes all that much because you never know what the hell you said. Especially in London, that's not easy.
My name's Anita Gonzalez. Gentlemen, I was 12 years old when Watergate broke, and today I brought my 12-year-old and his 12-year-old friend to meet you, so thank you for coming. My question is, in the citizen journalist new age of journalism, Joe Trippi, who's a fellow with you at the IOP this semester, has started a citizen journalism blog on MSNBC website where anybody can go on and report. What golden rules would you have for these citizen journalists? 2 sources. Can you name 3 or 4 things that you hope journalists, young ones, and others keep today?
There's only one thing I've ever required of any book journalist work for me. Is the story you are reporting a true and accurate representation of what you found out? And that to me is the only thing I care about. If I can be assured that what he's reporting is true and accurate and exactly what he found out, that's good enough for me. That's my only gauge of reporting.
What about you, Ben? Would you have anything to tell the bloggers or people who are going online to start out as reporters?
I'm not sure I want citizen reporters. That sounds like a letter to the editor to me.
What's wrong with citizen reporters?
Well, who hires them, who pays for them, and who no, you don't. How about citizen doctors?
Not the same thing.
Well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to speak harshly to you.
Hi, my name is Billy Glucroft. I'm a freshman journalism student at Emerson College. When I was younger and I would do something wrong, my parents would sit me down and bawl me out, and I'd say sorry. And my mom would give me her famous line, "Don't apologize, fix it." Earlier this year, the New York Times and I believe the Post and other papers analyzed their coverage of the run-up to the Iraq War, and they said, yeah, we screwed up, and we're sorry. And that was very nice and it was very noble, but I haven't seen it being fixed. And I open the newspapers today, and what do I see? I see genocide of Sudan on the back pages. I see the New York Times did a very lovely fact-checking during the campaign, but it was just a tiny little box also on the back pages. I turn on the TV, I see Lacey Peterson, Michael Jackson, the Dan Rathergate, as Fox News has coined it, and not that we went to war based on false pretext, and not that innocent people are dying in Sudan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When is the media going to fix it?
Ben, you're on, kid. I have no answer for that.
I mean, when is the media? Okay, who is the media? 1,200 newspapers, umpteen thousand talk shows, nightly news shows. What are you talking about? What are you really talking about? What paper?
What papers are you reading?
Well, there's thousands and thousands, but they're all owned by 5 people, 5 organizations.
No, that's not fair. That's not true.
So
the most papers, one company owns, I think, is it 100? That's a lot.
Gannett owns more than
any. On
any.
the other hand, some of them are real small, birdcage material.
Well, I think you're avoiding my question. What I'm saying is that the major papers, the Post, the Times, the major TV stations are still covering these sensational
You read those and listen to those?
Absolutely.
How?
How? My library at Emerson College has the Post, not the Post, the Times, the Christian Science Monitor, the Wall Street Journal. I have a TV with cable. I mean,
and you read those papers?
Absolutely, every day.
You're not seeing a lot of war coverage in the New York Times?
It's not a matter of the war coverage. It's a matter of the analysis. It's a matter of where it's being placed, the framing of it. It's a matter of what kind of play is it being given.
Well, I disagree with you.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. Is that all I'm going to get, though? I mean, is that it?
Yeah, that's it. I think you're wrong. I think
Well, why do you think I'm right? I mean, what do you think? I mean, how do you think you fixed? The Washington Post did admit that they didn't do enough adequate coverage of the lead up to the war. So how do you think you fixed that since then?
Well, I think probably what you're suggesting is they do nothing. They did something.
I'm saying they're not doing enough.
I was embarrassed by that piece, if you want the truth, and I thought that the New York Times piece was just as embarrassing. I don't think they really have a hell of a lot to hang their head about. I think let me talk about the Times. The war correspondence in the Times has been excellent. Excellent. The big newspapers, good newspapers, all have Arabic-speaking journalists there now. I think it's been terrific. I really do. I'm not so sure about the papers that I don't read, but and I don't talk about television because that's too complicated for me. But if you really want to find out what's going, it seems to me that you can pick. There's a handful of good newspapers in this country that you can read, and you know the answer. And if you think that maybe this story stresses this too much, maybe this doesn't exactly fit your preconception of it, you got to lump that.
And I think you've got to look at the New York Times differently. Above the fold is the old New York Times. It's beautifully written, it's important, it's all good stuff. Below the fold, there's stuff that I can't figure out how it got on page one. So that I think they're a little schizophrenic. I think they're trying to go for two different audiences, and I think maybe they're underestimating what youth in this country wants. But it looks to me, I get the Times every morning.
He wants it.
But I think if you look above the fold in the New York Times and you read John Burns, you read Dexter Filkins, you read what's coming out of Iraq, it's pretty damn, it's not pulling any punches, and it's telling it like it is, and it makes you kind of wonder the hell's the matter with our government. And they've done that pretty well, I think.
And Nightline, I think, has been doing some terrific reporting.
But ABC is wanting to dump Nightline now.
And I don't like defending the New York Times.
Sure as hell.
I hate doing that.
Let's go over here.
Hi, I have two questions, both related.
You gotta speak up.
A little louder, please.
Is that better?
Yes.
Two questions, both related to the question already asked and answered about bias, political bias specifically in the news. The first one was I was wondering if you had an opinion on whether networks and newspapers were either significantly or even unduly concerned about appearing biased. And the second question was more of if a young reporter was being swayed to take a story in a direction that appeared to them to take a point of view, like by an editor who had a point of view that was not supported by the facts of their story, what advice would you give them in continuing the story as accurately and truthfully as they wanted to?
I don't understand the last question.
If a reporter was being swayed by their editor to take a story they were writing in a biased direction, do you have any advice?
I don't know of any case that's happened.
Let him quit.
I don't know of any case where an editor has tried to swing a story one way or the other because it fits his own perception of what's true, what's not true. If he's worth being an editor, he doesn't do that.
Well, what if he's not worth being an editor?
Well, what would you do if you same situation in a bank? If somebody was working in a bank that didn't like the way the bank was being run, what do you think he should do about it?
Well, it's a good question. That's why I asked.
Out. Just let him get out.
Do you think quitting is the only answer?
Well, I mean, I think you could make your opinions known, but I think you would be closer to the door than you know.
I think the bottom line is, reporters are not as good as they think they are, and they're a lot better than you think they are. I think that's maybe the bottom line. I think that journalists, and I hate that word because it sounds like you got a doctorate in journalism, and I much prefer to be a reporter than a journalist, but I think they have an exaggerated sense of their own importance, and I've said this at several confabs of journalists. The question that's frequently asked of journalists, who died and left you in charge, is not an invalid question. I mean, sometimes we act that way. I'll tell you something that a lot of people think is heretical. I'm not sure that the Founding Fathers meant as much as we think they did by the First Amendment. There were no hidden cameras. There were no hidden microphones. There was no thing about invading people's privacy. And I think we've extended, after all, there was a guy named Tom Paine, and he was turning out a pamphlet, and he had every right to say what he wanted to say. I think that we have assumed that the Founding Fathers meant a lot more, and I think we do tend sometimes to invade privacy and make ourselves unpopular. That's why they call us the media. The media is a pejorative word. They call us the press when they like us, and they call us the media when they hate us.
I'm sorry, just the first question was about whether you thought networks or newspapers were significantly or unduly worried about appearing biased.
I think everybody is. I think department stores are. I think banks are. I think everybody in business in America is worried about their image. And you got to realize, a network is a conglomeration of local stations. They're owned by all sorts of businessmen all over America, and they all form this thing called a network. And the network is beholden to those guys because they're the ones that put them on the air. So that, sure, they worry about their image. Sometimes I disagree with what they worry about, but, you know, they run it. It's their candy store.
Thank you.
Let's go over here and try to get through the rest of these questions.
I actually have two questions. The first, do either of you men feel that with the new era of journalism, news available online, radio, that this generation will produce another evening news anchor such as Rather or Brokaw?
Do I think they should do what to Brokaw and all this? Be like them or succeed them?
There would be less and less people watching the nightly news if, with this, in the next 10 years, 20 years, that there will be another person of iconic stature such as Brokaw or
Sure. Yeah.
Rather.
And he'll probably be a woman. And for my money, as good an anchor man as there is anywhere on earth is Judy Woodruff. And I think women are every day, there are women coming up in journalism that just never happened before, and they're taking over, and they're great. And I think CBS would make a serious mistake if they didn't give serious consideration to teaming an anchor man with an anchor woman right now. They did it once with Dan Rather and Connie Chung. It didn't work because the chemistry was all wrong.
Why do they have to team someone?
Yeah.
How about just a woman?
Because right now, I think that's the first step. And I
Aren't we
think if they
beyond-
make that step, that eventually, because besides Judy Woodruff, I don't see anybody I think who could carry one. There's a BBC woman who was in Washington for a while and went back to London, and they didn't want to hire her because she had a British accent. But they were great. You know, Christiane Amanpour worked for me. She's sensational. And I think that the age of the woman is, you know, it's just like I keep wondering, where are Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson? What happened to them? They all disappeared. And I think if we ever find another one, it won't be a George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. It'll probably be a Georgette Washington or an Abigail Lincoln. And I think the same thing is going to happen in journalism. women have come on so fast in journalism, it's amazing. They're good. They're very good. Gals like Nora O'Donnell and Susan Malveaux, and they're really, really top-notch.
My name is Gary Ludwig. I'm from Hingham, Massachusetts. My question goes back to the topic of reporting on the war in Iraq. If the goal of reporting is to report the truth, then I'd like to know your comment on why there's such a void of reporting any facts on the number of civilian casualties for the Iraqi people or their the other militants. There's virtually nothing reported, especially in the media across the board. I know there's some written press, but it's not part of the mainstay of information being provided.
I
don't believe that.
I think I would like to know the answer to that question about the civilian casualties. How would you go about getting that story?
Again, you indicated earlier that you felt that the reporting in Iraq was excellent. That
Yeah, I think
Arabic translators that they're there on the site. It's hard to believe that somebody doesn't have this information, or at least a very good estimate.
Can I ask you a question? Is there anyone in this room who doesn't believe that Iraq is a monumental screw-up? I mean, where did you learn it? You learned it from your newspapers and you learned it from television. And you wouldn't have known it if we didn't have people there. It is maybe the worst chapter in the history of the United States. And if you know it, and you all know it, you know it because you read his newspapers and you watch our television.
But there were some who had that conviction before we actually engaged in the war. We didn't have to be told that.
Colin Powell, who didn't have the guts to get up and say it.
Right.
But I really would. I wish there was a reporter here from Iraq who could answer that. I mean, I think the story now is so hard to cover, so dangerous to cover. I mean, you can't send somebody into Mosul now and start counting bodies on the street. I don't know. I'm going to ask our foreign desk tomorrow, next day, if we've ever done something on that. And if not, why not? Let's give it a stab.
The one best story I've seen out of Iraq was Scott Pelley of CBS doing a story on a typical Iraqi family that said, for God's sake, get out of here and leave us alone, because every day you're just making things worse for us. And that told me more than anything else I've seen out of there. No, I think we have. If you don't know that Iraq is a mess, then you're not watching or reading anything, because it dominates the news.
So did Vietnam.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Do you think the ownership changes affect the quality and content of the news, such as the AOL and Time Warner merger?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Okay. Do you think as the ownership changes, do you think it affects the quality and content of the news, such as with the AOL and Time Warner merger?
Well, if the ownership of a paper changes, the paper will change.
Do you think it'll affect
I'm not sure that if the head of a ABC changes, that the news content won't change. I'd be very interested to see what happens to Koppel's show at night. The word around that town is that thing is on its last legs. And that will only be because they want to replace it with a big, fat, commercially important and rewarding program. But I think, sure, and I think as far as the ownership of a newspaper, if you want, these aren't toys. If you want to own a newspaper and have the wherewithal to buy it, you could run it any way you want. That's important. But you don't have to work there, and you don't have to read it.
Thank you.
You mentioned AOL Time Warner. I don't think Time Magazine changed at one iota when they merged with AOL. They may have screwed up badly in their own corporate accounting, but I don't think it was reflected in either CNN or Time Magazine.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't get to these other questions. We've been told that we need to stop at 7. Thank you all for coming, and especially to Ben and Don for coming up here and answering questions and having this conversation. It's just been great. And to the JFK Library for having everyone here.
Thank you.
Thank you.